It is 5:42 on March 20th, 2023. I am resuming my reading of V.I. Lenin, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, beginning on page 39. The banking system presents indeed the form of common bookkeeping and of the distribution of means of production on a social scale, but only the form, wrote Marx in Capital half a century ago. Russian translation, volume 3, part 2, page 144. The figures we have quoted on the growth of bank capital, on the increase in the number of the branches and offices of the biggest banks, the increase in the number of their accounts, etc., present a concrete picture of this common bookkeeping of the whole capitalist class, and not only of the capitalists, for the banks collect, even though temporarily, all kinds of money revenues, of small businessmen, office clerks, and of a tiny upper stratum of the working class. It is common distribution of means of production that, from the formal aspect, grows out of the modern banks, numbering some 3 to 6 of the biggest in France and 6 to 8 in Germany, control billions and billions. In substance, however, the distribution of means of production is by no means common, but private, i.e., it conforms to the interest of big capital and primarily of huge monopoly capital, which operates under conditions in which the masses of the population live in want, in which the whole development of agriculture hopelessly lags behind the development of industry, while within industry itself the heavy industries exact tribute from all other branches of industry. In the matter of socializing capitalist economy, the savings banks and post offices are beginning to compete with the banks. They are more decentralized, i.e., their influence extends to a greater number of localities, to more remote places, to wider sections of the population. Here is the data collected by an American commission on the comparative growth of deposits in banks and savings banks. As they pay interest at the rate of 4% and 4.25% on deposits, the savings banks must seek profitable investments for their capital. They must deal in bills, mortgages, etc. The boundaries between the banks and the savings banks become more and more obliterated. The chambers of commerce of Bochum and Erfurt, for example, demand that savings banks be prohibited from engaging in purely banking business, such as discounting bills. They demand the limitation of the banking operations of the post office. The banking magnates seem to be afraid that state monopoly will steal upon them from an unexpected quarter. It goes without saying, however, that this fear is no more than the expression of the rivalry, so to speak, between two department managers in the same office. For, on the one hand, the billions entrusted to the savings banks are in the final analysis actually controlled by these very same bank capital magnates, while, on the other hand, state monopoly in capitalist society is merely a means of increasing and guaranteeing the income of millionaires in one branch of industry or another who are on the verge of bankruptcy. The change from the old type of capitalism, in which free competition predominated, to the new capitalism, in which monopoly reigns, is expressed, among other things, by a decline in the importance of the stock exchange. The review, Die Bank, writes, "The stock exchange has long ceased to be the indispensable medium of circulation that it was formerly when the banks were not yet able to place the bulk of new issues with their clients. Every bank is a stock exchange, and the bigger the bank and the more successful the concentration of banking, the truer does this modern aphorism become. While formerly, in the 70s, the stock exchange flushed with the exuberance of youth, a subtle allusion to the stock exchange crash of 1873, to the company promotion scandals, etc., opened the era of the industrialization of Germany. Nowadays, the banks and industry are able to do it alone. The domination of our big banks over the stock exchange is nothing else than the expression of the completely organized German industrial state. If the domain of the automatically functioning economic laws is thus restricted, and if the domain of conscious regulation by the banks is considerably enlarged, the national economic responsibility of a few guiding heads is immensely increased. So writes the German professor Schulze Gavernitz, an apologist of German imperialism who is regarded as an authority by the imperialists of all countries and who tries to gloss over a detail, viz. That the conscious regulation of economic life by the banks consists in the fleecing of the public by a handful of completely organized monopolists. The task of a bourgeois professor is not to lay bare the entire mechanism or to expose all the machinations of the bank monopolists, but rather to present them in a favorable light. In the same way, Reiser, a still more authoritative economist and himself a banker, makes shift with meaningless phrases in order to explain away undeniable facts. Quote, the stock exchange is steadily losing the feature which is absolutely essential for national economy as a whole and for the circulation of securities in particular. That of being not only a most exact measuring rod, but also an almost automatic regulator of the economic movements which converge on it. End quote. In other words, the old capitalism, the capitalism of free competition with its indispensable regulator, the stock exchange, is passing away. A new capitalism has come to take its place, bearing obvious features of something transient, a mixture of free competition and monopoly. The question naturally arises, to what is this new capitalism passing? But the bourgeois scholars are afraid to raise the question. Quote, 30 years ago, businessmen, freely competing against one another, performed 9/10 of the work connected with their business other than manual labor. At the present time, 9/10 of this brain work is performed by officials. Banking is in the forefront of this evolution. End quote. This admission by Schulze Gavernitz brings us once again to the question. So what is this new capitalism in its imperialistic stage, passing? Among the few banks which remain at the head of all capitalist economy as a result of the process of concentration, there is naturally to be observed an increasingly marked tendency toward monopolist agreements, toward a bank trust. In America, not 9, but 2 very big banks, those of the billionaires Rockefeller and Morgan, control a capital of 11 billion marks. In Germany, the absorption of the Schaffhausenische Bankwährung of the Diskontogesellschaft, to which we referred above, was commented on in the following terms by the Frankfurter Zeitung, an organ of the stock exchange interest. Quote, the concentration movement of the banks is narrowing the circle of establishments from which it is possible to obtain credits, and is consequently increasing the dependence of big industry upon a small number of banking groups. In view of the close connection between industry and the financial world, the freedom of movement in industrial companies which need banking capital is restricted. For this reason, big industry is watching the growing trustification of the banks with mixed feelings. Indeed, we have repeatedly seen the beginnings of certain agreements between individual big banking concerns which aim at restricting competition. End quote. Again and again, the final word in the development of banking is monopoly. As regards the close connection between the banks and industry, it is precisely in this sphere that the new role of the banks is perhaps most strikingly felt. When a bank discounts a bill for a firm, opens a current account for it, etc., these operations taken separately do not in the least diminish its independence, and the bank plays no other part than that of a humble middleman. But when such operations are multiplied and become an established practice, when the bank collects in its own hands enormous amounts of capital, when the running of a current account for a given firm enables the bank, and this is what happens, to obtain fuller and more detailed information about the economic position of its clients, the result is that the industrial capitalist becomes more completely dependent on the bank. At the same time, a personal union, so to speak, is established between the banks and the biggest industrial and commercial enterprises. The merging of one with another through the acquisition of shares, through the appointment of bank directors to the supervisory boards or boards of directors of industrial and commercial enterprises, and vice versa. The German economist Heidels has compiled most detailed data on this form of concentration of capital and of enterprises. 6 of the biggest Berlin banks were represented by their directors in 344 industrial companies. And by their board members and 407 others, making a total of 751 companies. In 289 of these companies, they either had two of their representatives on each of the respective supervisory boards or held the posts of chairman. We find these industrial and commercial companies in the most diverse branches of industry: insurance, transport, restaurants, theaters, art industry, etc. On the other hand, on the supervisory boards of these 6 banks in 1910 were 51 of the biggest industrialists, including the director of Krupp, of the powerful Hapag, Hamburg American Line, etc., etc. From 1895 to 1910, each of these 6 banks participated in the share and bond issues of many hundreds of industrial companies, the number ranging from 281 to 419. We are going to end this selection at the bottom of page 45.